the book Words and Actions, Teaching World Languages Through the Lens of Social Justice, right here. Oh, you can't even see it, right here. Published by Actful. And they will talk about social justice and the university language learner today. Please help me in welcoming these three wonderful colleagues.
Thank you so much. Well, we were going to do a little intro, but it's been done for us. So that's such a nice start. We are so excited to be here with you today. I wish I could say it was sunny in New Jersey, but it's still pretty cloudy, but inching closer towards spring, which is super, super at least needed here, right? So where we're headed today, you do see that we did have a little image of our book, and most of the things that we'll talk about today stem from that work, starting with introductions and positionality, moving into a little bit of conversations around definitions and frameworks. We'll talk a little bit about critique and critiquing materials, and then we'll do some collaborative work to learn about your current points of entry and your next steps in enacting this work. And we do have our Twitter handles here. Feel free to, if you want to tweet during the session or after something exciting that you learned, or questions that you have, or thoughts that are inspiring to you. And so in terms of introduction, since we have so little time, we'd just love for you to add to the chat your name, the language that you teach, and the number of years that you've been at Cornell, just so that we can get a little bit of a sense who's in the audience. And I don't know that it was mentioned in our previous lives, I was a Spanish teacher at the high school and community college levels. Did you mention Cassie represents our German, and Pam French. Oh, Cassie's French, and also taught French as well. Okay. Before we get started, I also just wanted to acknowledge some of the frames of references that we bring to this work. And you can see just a few of the ways that the three of us collectively, or individually all identify. And in this list, likely you'll see a number of privileges, unearned privileges that we experience as being white middle class women. And we just wanted to put that out there, since we know that many of the issues that relate to justice connect to how we identify or how others identify us. And that we need to acknowledge those identities and understand the multiple oppressions that many face as a result of the way that they identify, or that they are identified by others. So that being said, I also think I speak for all of us when I say that we don't see ourselves as experts on all things social justice, but rather as stakeholders who are really interested in pushing our field forward, and hoping to facilitate conversations with other folks in our field to help, I guess, like I said, push the field forward, provide opportunities for us to support one another, and continue on this journey to learn more about what it means to advance social justice in our own classrooms and contexts. And I'm seeing all the introductions come through. Great to see such a range of experiences and 20 winters here. Yeah, I like the 20 springs. That's great. Next slide. So we are all language people in the house, so we're going to get started with some definitions. And this is a definition for social justice that we started using, 2014 when we wrote the first edition of the book. But I think that's still really, at its works. At its core, social justice is a philosophy and approach and actions. And this is a definition that hits all of those different angles, but that they all, a philosophy, approach, and actions that embody treating all people with fairness, respect, dignity, and generosity. And that being said, since so much work has been done over the last 20 years, and particularly the last 5 years, and even more so in the last year or so, could hit the next slide, we see social justice education and our work in particular as connecting to a lot of different ways of thinking, framing, philosophies in educational theory. I think some of these span, education and language education, a few different subfields, but including critical pedagogy, culturally sustaining pedagogy, intercultural competence, linguistically responsive pedagogy, anti-racist education. We see all of these things being connected to what we do as educators who enact social justice education in our curriculum, classrooms, and teaching. One of the frameworks that we found to be really useful is Heather Hackman had a paper, and this is back from 2005, but really robust framing of what it looks like to teach for social justice education. And this paper really stemmed from the concern that people were saying they were doing multicultural education, but oftentimes it really took on just a more of a celebratory, or a paper I read recently called it lazy multiculturalism, and just taking on more of a what we used to call the foods and fairs, those sorts of kind of more surface level aspects. So in terms of Hackman's model, she talks about there being 5 different pieces of this social justice education. First of which, if you start at that top left corner, being content mastery, and that there obviously needs to be some sort of factual information content, maybe in a language classroom, the cultural context, historical context, and this macro to micro content analysis. If you move to the right, she also talks about these tools for critical analysis, and particularly at the systems level, that as educators, we have to help students engage in this critical analysis and careful consideration of issues of oppression, and provide an application or a direction for students to apply some of these tools to what's going on in their lives, or what's happening that they're learning about in the content. If you go down to the bottom left, the tools for action and social change, she talks about this as social action being fundamental to our roles as citizens. And that, she says at one point, educators need to disrupt the notion that silence is patriotic, and that really our rights and responsibilities as a system carry, we need to participate, engage our voices, and, and at times protest. The personal reflection is something I think that many of us do pretty regularly as language educators, but it just reminds teachers for them to continually reflect on themselves, and to encourage students to reflect on their learning and their development. And the multicultural group dynamics is in the center, and you can see that it touches on all 4 of those other elements, because understanding the group dynamics of the classroom and the socially constructed identities of students and members of the group is really something that is so important, but that touches upon all of the tools. And so she says, it's not really something where, you're not doing social justice education if you don't incorporate all of these 5 things all the time into every lesson, but it's something that we should be striving for. And it recognizes that, oftentimes when we do, what we call diversity education or multicultural education or some of these things, that it tends to be, one of these elements that we stress. But really to do it well with a more critical lens, a critical approach, we need to incorporate all of these pieces. And could you get the next slide? Thank you. So one of the other tools that we really started to use, and that we think, even though it was written for P12 educators, what used to be called Teaching Tolerance, which is now Teaching for Justice website, has a set of standards that address these 4 different elements of social justice education. And basically there's 20 standards and there's 5 for each of these categories. And the identity ones focus really on recognizing that we all have multiple identities, affirming those identities, different elements around developing identity as well. Diversity is recognizing that there are different definitions of diversity, different elements of diversity, and that diversity brings with it oppression and differentials in terms of power and privilege. Justice looks at more of the systemic issues within society and has students recognizing them, responding to them. And then the action piece is, the actual what we do in response. So whether it's, one of the standards is as simple as speaking up, and another one is engaging in collective action. So we can see a couple examples of those on the next slide. And I'm just kind of curious, my guess is that these are some things that may look pretty familiar that you may be doing already. So for example, identity, students will develop language and historical and cultural knowledge that affirm and accurately describe their membership in multiple identity groups. My guess is, again, there's some things that you're doing in your classrooms, especially early on, that get at that piece of identity. Ranging all the way down to the action on number 17, students will recognize their own responsibility to stand up to exclusion, prejudice, and injustice. And these are all just, again, additional tools that we can use to sort of shape where we're headed with our work. And we like these as a really nice, we think these are a really nice starting point for, okay, I want to, plan something in my classroom, whether it's an activity or a whole lesson, or maybe a larger piece of instruction, a unit. Where could I start? And these provide a really nice roadmap.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can start thinking, and not to say that you are not already doing this, but if you're sort of wondering, well, where do I begin with working on this in my own class? Some of you, from the feedback, it sounds like some of you have been teaching for a long time. Some of you are maybe newer to teaching language, and so you've either developed materials over years or found materials that you like, or perhaps you're just discovering now. And I think that it's important, and we think that it's important to start where you are, not to say, okay, well, I'm going to, erase everything and start over and think about these, these 4 domains from the social justice standards or Hackman's model, but rather starting where you are. And one way to do that is through critical thinking. And we'll talk in a moment about entry points, but critical thinking is a good way to sort of identify what some of the entry points might be. So questions you can ask yourself as you look at your current materials, and you can just click through these, Cassie, because there's just, I've animated everything in the slide. I went a little animation crazy. So you can see here, these are some questions that I've picked that I think are good for particularly world language or English language materials. Who benefits from whatever that material is, who benefits from looking at this particular, looking at this poem or looking at this editorial, who wrote it, who is included or excluded, what voices are included or not. That's a great thing to look at. There have been a lot of studies in various fields about things like who's pictured in textbooks or who's pictured in materials, whose stories are included or excluded. What other perspectives might there be on something? What assumptions are made? Are there assumptions made about who is reading it? Are there assumptions made about who would be interested in the topic, about what people's opinions would be who are reading something? Are there places where the materials could be improved? What assumptions are made about how this is relevant to the student? And why is it relevant? Why are we assuming it's relevant? One example I can think of is, I think particularly at the high school level, a lot of materials that teachers like talking about, boy-girl relationships, right? And sort of like, because they think that's going to be, I think definitely when I was a teacher, I thought that would be interesting to students, is talking about romance and things like that. Well, who appears in those stories about romance? I mean, heterosexual romance. It's always, I mean, it tends to always be stories about that. And who doesn't appear in those stories? So who in the class is this relevant to, and who is it not relevant to? So thinking about that as you present, as those stories are shared, that maybe it is, that there's an assumption that it's relevant, but thinking again about who the students are and who they might be, questioning that a little bit. And that goes back to who is included and excluded. And not to say that heterosexual relationships can never be examined or brought forth or portrayed in materials, but is that the only type of relationship? The only type of family, for example? I know we'll be talking about that in a minute. Then how do the materials disrupt? Is there anything that the materials do that might challenge students' thinking? And you can see on the right, I know it's probably pretty small depending on the size of your screen. These are some other questions. If you just look up critical thinking questions, if you don't like the ones that I've pulled, there are great examples out there that you can just find on the internet that apply to different content areas of just how do you look at what you already have and do some questioning of that. Next slide, please. So some examples are, this is something that was in my textbook when I was a French teacher. It was a culture blurb. I hope that your materials don't have that many culture blurbs, but I think that they persist sometimes. But it was about Marseille, which is a city in France. And these were the main points that it said. Marseille is a port city. It's connected, it has a history with the Roman Empire. Here are some important monuments that you can find in Marseille. And here are some trade products that go through Marseille, right? So then, if you could click, we can ask, what does this do? Who's included? Who wrote this? Who's included and excluded? What is another perspective? What are the assumptions? Why are these things highlighted? And then how does this disrupt? I think in this case it doesn't disrupt very much. The great thing is we can go back to some of the things that Beth presented about critical thinking and tools for critical analysis. You don't have to do this work necessarily as the instructor. You can have your students do this work. You can have them look at this and say, well, what is included and not included? I mean, Marseille is a huge town with many different cultures represented there. There are many immigrant populations, and not immigrant, but people whose parents, grandparents, great-grandparents immigrated. So there's a huge history of connection with Northern Africa, as well as other parts of France, as well as other countries in Europe. So and the industries have been changing, and that's made a big influence on what's happening in the city. So bringing in some of that information can be really a great way to sort of bring in some of these social justice themes. One more example, this is something that you might also see in a textbook, a vocabulary list. And so you can see that this is from Sacmal. The other example was from it was from C'est à Toi, which was a high school French textbook that I used all the years that I taught, actually. This is from Sacmal, a German textbook, but and this has different stars where the different vocabulary words are highlighted. That's the vocabulary that's being taught, right? The little blue dots. So again, who's in here, who's not in here? What are the assumptions that are made? Where could this be improved? What vocabulary is being taught and not taught? Who's in the image and who's not in the image? And that's, again, something you can bring to your students. But the idea is that every material that you used, put it through some of that critical analysis and think critically about it. And some things may open up as you're doing that. So for example, with Marseille, you might say, well, this is a great opportunity to talk about immigration in France, even if it's at a lower level. This might be a great opportunity to talk about housing issues, housing differences in Germany. So there are lots of different ways that you can start with the materials that you have. And I'll pass it over to Cassie to continue talking about entry points.
Thanks, Pam. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about reframing some typical topics that we see in the world language classroom. And so let's just kind of take this topic by topic. And so we'll start with something like professions, careers. And I chose topics that we tend to see, especially at the university level, that we tend to see in the novice levels, and then we come back to them again as we move through intermediate levels, advanced levels. But each time that we come back to them, we're adding on to it, we're leveling up, we're looking at it from a different perspective. We're using maybe more complex materials to look at the topic. So, I mean, I think we can do the same thing as we're reframing. We can level up each time so we can lay the groundwork at those novice levels and start to challenge students with these critical topics at the novice level and get them thinking about it. And then as they cycle up, we can keep adding to the base that we've built. So, if we start with professions, careers, we can examine gender, who's represented, who's not represented in the target cultures, and our, even in our, if you use a textbook, and we could look at other readings, other materials, which professions are even represented in the materials that we're using. If you use a textbook, for example, we very often see more white collar types of jobs represented. And so, again, just like Pam was talking about, what can we disrupt with that? What can we come at with a more critical lens? What kinds of value judgments are there around the types of professions? So, for example, blue collar jobs in a lot of target cultures are highly valued in a way that sometimes they're not in the United States. So what kind of comparisons can we make between target cultures and the students' own cultures? And then as we keep moving up, we can look at discrimination in hiring. So for example, if we look at even CVs and the way that CVs are designed, one of the topics that I covered with intermediate students often is this idea of, putting your picture on a CV and how that, that's the norm. That's what you do, is put your picture on there. But when you do that, is there discrimination against gender? Is there discrimination against race, age? What kinds of discrimination takes place? And can you pull authentic stories that people tell about discrimination that they've faced in hiring or in interviewing, and look at some of those types of issues around representation and discrimination in various careers and professions. And another thing that you could do in novice levels or even in intermediate is to look at some of those unseen heroes in communities as well, who, again, kind of going back to value judgment, who is valued, and who's kind of, who are the people in our communities doing jobs that maybe we don't think about, we don't talk about, and then look at it in target cultures as well. And so if we move to family and home, starting again kind of at the novice level, thinking about moving away from, any kind of heritage projects, any kind of family trees, things like that, and being more inclusive and thinking about families as instead of families, because if we think about our students' needs, we have a lot of students who just don't want to talk about their families or their homes. Even at the college level, I find that often with students, and you probably do as well. And so, circles of care can be the way that we can come at family, community, home, and sometimes, family is what we make it. And so, who's in your circle of care? And then representation of families in images and media, representing different kinds of families, but really interrogating, so for example, if I take my area, if I'm looking at various media of families, various images in that we see in ads and things like that, how are families represented? Are there different types of families represented as I look at different media in German-speaking countries? What kinds of interrogation can students do around that? And that can even be done at the novice level with some really good scaffolding. We can move into, as we move up into higher proficiency levels, looking at gender roles in homes, in our own culture, in target cultures. Oftentimes we get into chore vocabulary as we talk about the home. That tends to be more at the novice level, but can you reframe that instead of talking about, well, I do this chore and I have to do these chores on Saturday, and reframe that to looking at gender roles of chores at home and things that people do or don't do, and then compare it to target cultures. And then as we keep moving up, can we look at gentrification in various cities and in target cultures and in our own communities closer to home? Can we look at redlining, compare and contrast between target cultures and the US? Like, can we look at housing prices as it relates to gentrification, redlining, things like that? And then, you know, again, just these very typical topics, just some additional ideas. You know, I wanted to mention with food and meals, I had a recent conversation with some high school German teachers that actually teach the college credit level. And one of the German teachers does, with the food unit, does something with homelessness and in their own community, and helps plan, works with the community organization and plans with the students every year to help make sandwiches and distribute the sandwiches, but they do all the planning in German. They do the shopping list, and, you know, and they come together and they make the sandwiches, and they do all of that in the target language. And then they work with the community organization to distribute. So there's an actionable element there that fits in really nicely with this topic. But, you know, again, we can look at poverty and hunger. We can, you know, dig into that community outreach, look at organizations and target cultures that are combating hunger. And so looking at, you know, in target cultures, where is advocacy taking place? Where is action taking place? That can be really hopeful. And it can show students, you know, these are the things taking place in the target cultures. What can we do in our own communities that are similar? Communications in media, we can look at bias, representation, and ads in media. We can look at, you know, the power of social media in affecting change. I think we've seen that often in the last year in particular. Social media has been really powerful, and those are easy snippets that you can pull from social media in the target language, even for novice levels. Even looking at the way that immigrants and refugees have used technology to sustain their own languages and cultures and stay connected. With visual and performing arts, Donna Clementi actually developed this really neat sample unit on street art. And I think we can take that a lot of different directions in the way that street art and graffiti are used, again, to promote change, represent perspectives and voices, using music to promote social change. There's a German artist named Sammy Deluxe who discusses representation of BIPOC in the media through the song. So that's a really nice jumping off point. And then getting into contemporary life, right? Looking at various equity issues in the school system, in school policies and target cultures. And, you know, that's the kind of inquiry that students can engage in. Like Pam was saying, you don't have to do all of the work. The students can engage in that inquiry and teach you and the rest of the class as well. Looking at the hidden curriculum, etiquette, customs, unwritten rules around customs, things like that.
So essentially what we'd like you to do is think about your own curriculum. We've given you some examples, and think about a place in your curriculum now where you feel like you could bring in some of the social justice goals, or, you know, you could bring in ideas of perhaps more identity, you know, student identity or identities in the target cultures, something where you could bring in more diversity. How do you, you know, how can you approach more diverse perspectives? Is there a point in your curriculum where you could perhaps bring in different perspectives, or action, right? Is there a place where perhaps you could bring in a project where you could do action in the community? And you could, and justice, where you could perhaps bring in causes of justice. So if you would like to just point out, and you know what, if you're already doing something, please put that up there too, because these are just going to be places where we can share. So what are some things that you do with social justice?
Okay, good. Street names and colonialism in German cities. Absolutely. Immigration, environmental justice is always a really good topic, and there are a lot of different ways that we can go with that. Good. Yeah, the idea of some community outreach, but you know, again, finding out, you know, what, instead of assuming what are the needs of a particular organization or a particular group of people in our communities or beyond our communities, can we work with them to find out how we could be true partners in that, right? Exactly, to highlight their needs, advocacy, action. Good. Yeah, you could look at the Stolpersteine.
Maybe refresh again.
Yep. There we go. Okay, good. Yes, exactly. Stereotypes. There's circles of my multicultural self that sometimes is a nice jumping off point, and you can easily do things like that. Some of those identity types of activities in the target language, those translate really well. And gender and race and representation in textbooks, absolutely. Oh, go ahead, Pam.
I was just going to say that's also a very easy thing to do with lower level because it involves counting. So you could do things like, involves counting and categorizing. So you could, you have, very intelligent students at Cornell, and so they're probably already thinking about these issues of equity. And so, invite them to examine that textbook and make that a part of the conversation. Try to avoid presenting the textbook as, or not just, and you might not all use textbooks, but try to, don't present that as the ultimate authority, but rather encourage them to engage critically with it by something like that. And again, at the lower levels, that's pretty easy to do because it's just counting and categorizing. Sorry, go ahead, Cassie.
No, that's good. Thanks. Let's see. The use of inclusive language in Spanish. Great. Yes. And there have been just a lot of really wonderful resources in many different languages and webinars on using inclusive language. Pam, what's the name of he's a French professor. He's been doing a lot with inclusive language. Yes. Thank you. So he's a good person to follow. Health disparities around COVID.
Absolutely.
That's a really good one. Imperialism, language government of ruling through institutions geographically situated in certain countries directly associated with the target language. Really good. Very good. I'll refresh one more time just to make sure.
Okay.
Then we'll move on.
Here.
In my advanced class, there was a module on food choice, how religious and other practices influence food choice, halal food, social and religious persecution based on food choices. Excellent. That's a really good one. And you could easily do that in a variety of languages and even at the intermediate level. Good.
Okay, sorry, I'm trying to answer questions in the chat. I'll put Chris Knies, I know he's on Twitter too. I'll make sure that gets put up, but yeah, he's doing some great work on that.
Yes. Thank you.
And so now what we're going to do is we're going to have a little breakout room discussion before we stop for questions, because it is, we've given you a lot of ideas and information and hopefully you're processing some of it. So what we'll have you do now is to look, we have 3 example lessons. And they're sort of geared towards 3 levels. They're very, very briefly described because we're not going to make you read a whole lesson plan. It's just very, very brief description. So sometimes that can be challenging. So just try to fill in the blanks. Thank you, and Angelika. I got your name pronounced right too. So what you're going to do is take a look, and you're going to pick the room that goes with the level that you teach, roughly. So there's breakout room 1 is the beginner level, breakout room 2 is sort of intermediate, and breakout room 3 is advanced, or 1 is more sort of level 1, year 1, 2 is year 2, 3 is 3+. And I realize you may teach multiple levels. I'm sure that some of you teach all the levels. So pick the one you think would be most interesting to you to examine.
Well, I'm a little bit disconnected here, of course, but I was just wondering on the outside, is this impulse of introducing these elements into the curriculum, is this happening in other fields of instruction, or is this something that's focused on, or that language teachers have taken up, and not so much other fields? Does anybody have a feel for that? And I think it's great if it's mostly language teachers. We're often in the forefront of pedagogy innovation.
I'll just say briefly from what I've observed at the K-12 level and knowing my colleagues here in the College of Education, I think English language arts and social studies have been working with these concepts for a long time. I think that math and science, perhaps less so. I think that that's my idea. I do think that there are definitely mathematics and science educators who are really looking to incorporate more social justice into the way that they approach their field. But I think it's much more common in English language arts and social studies. So so at the university level, we're talking, again, the English classes, area studies, history. I think it's more common in those areas.
That's what I see at the post-secondary level as well, in particular. So if we just focus on a post-secondary level, I see this happening much more in the humanities than I do. Like even in our religion courses at Concordia, they're taking a critical social justice stance. Much less so we're actually adopting a core curriculum that is focused on social justice, and the science and math areas are having a harder time connecting to that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say at our institution, we're connecting across campus in groups to look at what, particularly around an anti-racist curriculum would look like across campus, and providing supports for colleagues who, are new to the work or maybe don't see how it's relevant to their fields, and thinking about how we can also make it more systemic. So how can we ensure that it's happening across disciplines and across classrooms and not just in little pockets.
We have 2 questions in chat. Philomena, do you want to ask yours or should I read it out?
Can I ask it? I'm wondering about how you went about initiating the movement, the transformation, or how did you make those initial connections, if they were cross-disciplinary? Like where did you start?
In that I'm not in a language department, I'm in a college of ed, so it's a little bit different, but I know that we've worked with teachers where they, I think one thing that's important is to have some allies, to have a group that is interested in this, because if you're by yourself, that can just be so, by definition, isolating and hard, so if you can find some people who are interested in the work, and then we always recommend, make incremental changes. You don't have to overhaul the whole curriculum, but incorporate things bit by bit so that you're able to make it a part of every day, or make it a part of every course has an element of social justice in it. That's sort of, I believe in sort of incremental change with some of these topics that can be challenging for people, and then also allies. So I think those are 2 things that I've seen that I'd recommend.
I was going to say in our department, we've done a lot of shared readings, and then we spent actually a couple years really looking deeply and developing common language. We're a mix of language ed, bilingual ed, different education department, but developing common definitions around some of these key ideas that we wanted to ensure were happening throughout our courses, regardless of what the content. And then also determining what our values were. And that often led to good conversations about what what is right and just, and how that shapes the kind of teaching and learning experiences that our students have. So it's not something that's a quick and easy, but I think it's so worth it if you're willing to engage in that as a department.
Amy, what about your question?
I think it was answered, but I was just asking if there was any other resource that besides the actual book, which I read it before. And yes, it's the work of adjusting and adapting to the college level, but I don't know if there was something already like done at the higher level where it's already adapted and maybe focused on languages, or I don't know. I'm just wondering if there is anything specific.
There are definitely some experts out there who do focus more on the post-secondary level. I think especially the second edition of our book has more post-secondary examples. We do focus on the World Readiness Standards, which tends to be a more K-12 thing. But but we do, I think that those definitely are used in some, some university contexts. But I know, for example, LJ Randolph, he does some work with university, specifically university anti-racism. Who are some other names you guys can recommend for university work? It's not really publications, but there's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the work at post-secondary is more around issues than the more practical piece is the problem.
That's what I was saying.
Have a book coming out soon that has some good examples of post-secondary, and that's in the next year.
What about chats or like chat communities or something in chats, or do you know if there are any of those?
Well, and I think that's the thing that we argue a lot, and especially in this book, that there's just not enough out there.
Right.
So we definitely need more, more people thinking about this and producing materials and providing, and collaborating on all of this.
I think at the post-secondary level, so much of it is more theoretical, and just there aren't a lot of things that are ready-made that you can take and you can use and you can apply really easily. So that, I mean, it goes back to your issue of, well, you have to adapt it, and unfortunately, you're right, we need more. So
it feels like there is a lot when you try to do something, but then at the same time there is like nothing and a lot. And when I guess sometimes in this dynamic, when I want to do something, and then when I look for in the internet or something to a specific topic, then you find way too much and get overwhelmed. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
it does.
Especially if it's immigration topics or something like that, there's just way too much, and then you're trying to filter, and so I don't know, that's kind of where I'm at right now.
That's a definite challenge. Absolutely.
And ACTFL has some additional materials out there, part of various SIGs, and the AATs also have more language-specific materials. And depending on who the authors of those materials are, you can kind of filter by, is this more applicable to K-12 versus post-secondary? But that could be something else to sift through as well.
Yeah, if you belong to ACTFL, the critical and social justice approaches SIG is one really good resource. That community page, there are a lot of post-secondary folks in that particular SIG. It's a high percentage of post-secondary in that SIG, and they're always sharing things. And so you can post in the community and say, hey, does anybody have a lesson in French on this topic at the post-secondary level? And you're going to get quite a few responses in the community from different folks. So so that's a good place to go to.
Looks like we have one more raised hand.
Oh,
Yeah, Razima.
so with my language, I feel like there's it's full of materials for social justice. If I can just build on all the themes, whether it's, topics in Bangladesh and West Bengal, but a lot of time, or even in the communities in the US, especially, there's like authentic materials that's just based on the lives of immigrants. And there's a newspaper which kind of has this discourse. If you analyze the materials, a lot of it is either it's immigration help, like there are specific advertisements. It's like the housing issues, medical, healthcare, and so on. So for my intermediate class, there was a lot of emphasis that we put, like reading authentic material and all those units that kind of come across without you even putting on it. But what I found really difficult is that, again, the structured designing and analyzing these topics throughout your curriculum, that becomes very challenging and time consuming.
Yes.
And obviously, when I'm looking at newspaper language, it's advanced level. And a lot of time just, adapting to it to the other levels becomes a bit of problematic. So what do you suggest, like taking some authentic material and putting it in the other, and not necessarily, sort of, going into the discussion in English, but keeping it in target language, but simplifying it for other levels? What do you suggest?
I think those are all great ideas. I think, I think the idea that we're sort of de-authenticating texts by adapting them to lower learners I think that's problematic. I think that it's fine to take a text and to simplify the language significantly for lower learners, lower level learners, lower proficiency learners. I think, sometimes we do suggest that maybe have a reading outside of class that's in English, and then come back in the group that I was in the small group that I was discussing with earlier. We talked about just looking for specialized language to help, so identifying certain terms in the readings can be a good activity related to specific issues like immigration. How do you say these different types of immigration status in the language? So focusing just on some vocabulary. But yeah, so I think, yeah, and yeah, I'm sure that there's not, you teach Bengali, right? Yeah. So I'm sure that there are materials out there, but it's not like in the US, for US learners, there's not the same amount that there is in Spanish or French, in some of the more commonly taught languages. So you have to create your own, and that's so much work. That's why the incremental change can sometimes be helpful, to just think about bringing in a little bit at a time as opposed to changing everything, because that's just so overwhelming. Beth or Cassie?
The only other thing, you touched on that, Pam, is to, especially, well, really at any level, but for us as language teachers, to leverage translanguaging more and letting students move back and forth between their own language and the target language, and really capitalizing on that as you're working with the content, because there is going to be that transfer of knowledge then from one language to the next. And so, I think even letting them do some investigation in their own language and then bringing that conversation back in the target language can be helpful too. But it is, the challenge that you raise is definitely, that's a real challenge that teachers face, and we see that often.
Well, great. We are a little bit over time here. Thank you so much to the three of you for a very informative talk, giving us lots of food for thought, lots of wonderful starting points for all levels of language instruction. Please help me in thanking our presenters for their inspiration here, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks for joining us today.